The backcountry permit for the Great Smoky Mountains allows 8 people in a single party. Not 9, not 10, 8. Larry Patterson read that number off the kiosk screen in a voice loud enough for the whole parking lot to hear, because Larry was the sort of man who enjoyed a rule when the rule happened to agree with him, and we were exactly 8. I thought it was a good omen at the time. 8 people, 3 days, 1 clean loop. Big Creek Trail to the campsite at Walnut Bottom. Up Swallow Fork to the ridge, a night beneath the old fire tower on Mount Sterling, then down Baxter Creek in the morning and out before the traffic through Gatlinburg turned into a parking lot. That was the plan we printed. I still have the copy. It is folded into quarters, and it has a brown stain across the second page that I have never been able to convince myself is coffee. Let me tell you who we were, because it matters later, when the counting starts. Beverly Long was 65 and had been walking these mountains since before the tourist buses learned the way. She was born on the North Carolina side, near enough to Cataloochee that she still called the elk newcomers, and she carried a wooden walking stick with a copper cap that her father had made. She hiked slower than any of us, and she was never once at the back. Larry Patterson was 52. He owned 4 kinds of navigation device and trusted none of us with any of them. Tiffany Hughes was 41 and filmed everything. Her phone was out before the trailhead sign was behind us. She had a channel with a small following and a habit of narrating her own life in the present tense. Jordan Flores was 48 and had spent 9 years on a volunteer search and rescue team in the Nantahala. Jordan noticed things. Jordan counted exits. Jordan was the only one of us who packed a second headlamp and a second set of batteries for the second headlamp. Denise Washington was 54 and worked trauma nights at a hospital in Knoxville. She had seen more of what a human body can survive than the rest of us combined, and she had a flat, unhurried way of speaking that made everything sound survivable. Harold Butler was 62, and Harold brought a rifle. I want to be careful about how I say this, because people have opinions. Discharging a firearm inside a national park is illegal. Harold knew that. His argument was that the loop passed close to the boundary, that we would be crossing into national forest land on the last morning for a scouting trip he had planned for the fall, and that a man his age with 2 knee replacements was not going to walk 5 miles into black bear country with nothing but a whistle and good intentions. He carried it broken down in his pack for the first 2 days. Nobody made him unpack it. That is on all of us. Alicia Simmons was 46 and barely spoke for the first 3 hours. She was Beverly's niece by marriage, and she had come along because Beverly had asked her to, and because she had recently stopped answering the phone for anyone else. Alicia was the first one of us to hear it, and I was the 8th name in the register at the trailhead, written last, because I was holding the pen while everybody else adjusted their straps. Big Creek Trail is an old logging road. It is wide and gentle, and it follows the water the whole way, and for the first 2 hours it was the most pleasant walking I have ever done. Rhododendron closed over the path in long green tunnels. The creek ran green and loud below us, and where it pooled it went a blue that does not look like it belongs in Tennessee. We passed Midnight Hole and watched 3 teenagers throw themselves off the rock into water cold enough to steal the breath out of them. We passed Mouse Creek Falls, and Tiffany filmed it from 4 angles. The strangeness began at about mile 4, and it began so small that I have spent 2 years wondering whether I invented it afterward. There were no birds. Not silence exactly. The creek was still roaring. Insects still worked in the leaf litter. But the layered noise of a southern Appalachian summer forest, the wood thrush and the vireo and the endless argument of the crows, all of it had gone, and the absence had a shape to it, like a room where the refrigerator has just stopped humming. Jordan noticed at the same moment I did. I saw it happen. Jordan stopped, tilted the left ear up toward the canopy, and stood there for 6 or 7 seconds with a face I did not like. Bear, probably, Jordan said. Or a cat. Something moved through. Beverly did not say anything. Beverly took her stick in both hands and looked up the slope on the north side of the trail, not scanning the way you look for wildlife, but fixed, the way you look at a person. We reached the campsite at Upper Walnut Bottom a little after 5. It is a good site, flat and open under the big trees, with the creek close and the bear cables strung between 2 poles. Larry organized the tents into a horseshoe. Denise got water going. Harold sat on a log and rubbed his knee and told a long story about a boar hunt in 1994 that Alicia laughed at politely twice. At dusk, the whip-poor will started. It came from across the creek, maybe 80 yards out, and at first it was the most ordinary sound in the world. 3 notes, over and over, the way that bird has called over these mountains for 10,000 years. Beverly stopped stirring the pot. Tiffany said, "That is so pretty." Beverly said, "Listen to it again." We listened. 3 notes, 3 notes, 3 notes, and then 4. The bird added a note. It ran the pattern again, and it added another, and then it held the last one too long, stretching it out into something with a wet edge on it, and then it stopped in the middle, exactly in the middle, the way a person stops when they realize they are being watched. I looked at Beverly. All the color had gone out of her face. "Do not answer it," she said. "Whatever any of you hear tonight, do not answer it." Nobody slept much, but the reasons were still ordinary reasons. New ground, thin pads, the creek loud enough to sound like traffic, Harold snoring through nylon 2 tents away. I woke at some hour past 2 with the specific certainty that the sound outside my tent was a footstep, not a branch, not a settling log, a footstep, deliberate, with weight behind it and a pause after it, the pause being the part that turned my stomach over. Animals do not pause like that. Animals move with purpose or they do not move. This thing took a step and then waited, and I lay there in a bag that had gone cold and counted my own heartbeats until it took another one. It walked the horseshoe, all the way around the outside of our tents, slow, 1 step every 4 or 5 seconds, and each time it came near the wall I was lying against, I could hear it breathing. It breathed like something too large for the amount of air it was getting. Then it started saying my name. I need you to understand that it was not a voice at first. It was a shape of a voice, the way a child sounds through a wall when you cannot make out words. It said my name once, from over by the food storage. Then it said my name again, closer, and the second time it was better. The second time it had picked up the way Beverly says my name, the little lift she puts on the end. I did not answer. I have thought about that 1,000 times since. I did not answer, and I do not know if that is why I am here. Toward 4 it stopped, and the birds came back with the light like nothing had happened at all. What we found in the morning is the part I have trouble telling in the right order. The bare cables at Walnut Bottom are strung 12 feet up. You clip your food bag on a pulley and haul it into the air, and it hangs there in the middle of the span where nothing that walks can reach it. We had 4 bags up, 3 were still hanging. The 4th was on the ground, and it had been opened from the top. Larry kept saying that was impossible, and he was right, which is why he kept saying it. Nothing that climbs the pole can get out along a bare steel cable. The bag had not been chewed, it had been unclipped. The carabiner was closed and hanging empty on the pulley, and the food was laid out on the ground beneath it in a line, item by item, oldest packaging to newest, every wrapper intact and every seal unbroken. Alicia knelt beside it and did not touch anything and said, very quietly, "It sorted it." Denise found the tracks at the edge of the site where the mud came up out of the creek. There were 2 sets and they were the same set. The first was a deer track, a whitetail, unremarkable, walking in from the water. 6 feet later the same trail continued, in the same line, at the same stride. And the print had changed into something long and narrow with 4 toes and a heel that pressed deep, like a foot that had been stretched. Jordan photographed them with a trekking pole laid alongside for scale. Jordan did not say anything about them. Jordan just took the pictures, and I watched a person with 9 years of search and rescue training stand up and put a hand flat on the top of a head to keep it from shaking. We voted to hike out. Beverly wanted the ridge. That surprised everybody. She said the ridge was open ground and the tower was steel and high, and that whatever this was worked in close cover and voices and doubt. She said going back down the creek meant 5 miles inside a green tunnel where you cannot see 40 feet. Larry wanted the shortest line to a road, which was back down Big Creek. 6-2, we went down. Half a mile below the campsite, we came to the junction sign. Trail signs in that park are brown routed wood on a post, and they do not move. This one had been turned, not knocked, not leaning, not damaged. Turned, so that the arrow for Big Creek pointed up the mountain and the arrow for Swallow Fork pointed down the water. And the post had been reset in the ground so tightly that Larry could not rock it with both hands and his whole body weight. Tiffany filmed it. Later, when she showed me the clip on the drive, there was a sound on the audio that none of us heard while we were standing there. It is under Larry's voice, low, and it goes on for 11 seconds. It is the sound of somebody imitating the noise a person makes when they are trying not to laugh. We kept going down. The trail was the trail. The creek was on our right where it belonged. Everything was correct and everything was wrong, and I could feel the wrongness the way you feel a low ceiling in the top of your skull. At about a mile, Jordan stopped the whole line with one raised hand. There was somebody standing on the trail ahead of us. 400 feet, maybe, where the path bent and the rhododendron opened. A man, tall, wearing a canvas hunting coat the color of old tobacco, the kind nobody has manufactured since the 60s. He had his back to us. He was not walking. He was standing in the middle of the tread with his arms down at his sides, and his head was tilted a little too far over toward his right shoulder. Harold cupped his hands and called out a hello. The figure did not turn around. It went down onto all fours in one motion, and then it went up the slope, and the slope there is close to 60 degrees of wet root and loose leaf, and it covered 100 vertical feet in the time it took me to understand what I was seeing. Nobody screamed. That is the detail people never believe. 8 adults watched that happen and not one of us made a sound, because there is a level of fear underneath screaming, and it is very quiet. Larry ran. He got maybe 60 yards down the trail before Jordan caught him, and there was a short, ugly struggle in the middle of the path that ended with both of them on the ground in the leaves. Jordan held on and kept saying the same thing over and over into his ear, which was that running downhill in front of it was exactly what a deer does. We went back up to Walnut Bottom. It took 90 minutes because Harold could not be hurried, and because Beverly stopped every 100 yards to look behind us, and by then a wall of gray had come over the ridge and the rain started. And rain in the Smokies in July does not fall, it arrives. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes. Everything went the color of dishwater. The creek came up brown and started moving logs. Somewhere in that rain we lost the trail. I want to be precise here because it is the part Larry never accepted. We did not wander off. We were on the tread, and the tread was under our boots, and then the tread went into a laurel slick and did not come out the other side. Larry's satellite unit put us 400 yards north of where any trail exists. He reset it twice. He held it up to the sky. The track it recorded that afternoon, when he finally showed it to me in a hotel lobby in Waynesville, is a closed loop. We walked a circle roughly a quarter-mile across, 3.5 times, and every one of us would have sworn we were walking in a straight line uphill. The clearing was in the middle of that circle. It was about the size of a tennis court, and it should not have existed, because the canopy above it was unbroken. Something had cleared it from below, and hanging at the edges of it, at a height of maybe 7 feet, were the hides. Deer, mostly. A few I could not identify. They were not thrown there, and they were not caught in the branches. They had been hung, whole, hollowed out and spread open with the legs stretched wide, and they were arranged facing inward in a rough ring. And in the center of the ring, the ground had been scraped down to bare dirt in a circle about 6 feet across. The smell was the thing that broke Tiffany. It was not rot. Rot I could have handled. It smelled the way a wet dog smells, and underneath that it smelled like a hot penny. And underneath that, faint and completely impossible, it smelled like wood smoke and somebody's perfume. Denise, who works nights in a trauma unit, took one look at the way the hides had been opened and said the word clean. She said it twice. Alicia walked into the middle of the ring before anyone could stop her. She stood in the scraped circle with the rain running off her hood, and she turned around slowly, and her face was doing something I have no word for. When Jordan pulled her back out, she was not crying. She was smiling, and she was apologizing for smiling, and she could not stop. She said, "Somebody was in here calling for me. It sounded like me. It was standing right here calling my own name in my own voice, and I almost said yes." We left that clearing at a speed that was not safe on that ground, and 40 minutes later we came out onto the Swallow Fork Trail, 1,100 feet above where we had started, which is not a thing that can happen in 40 minutes, with a 62-year-old man on 2 artificial knees. If you are still with us in these mountains, take 1 second and hit that like button before the next part, because what happened when Harold finally put the rifle together is the piece my family has asked me never to say out loud. We made camp on the ridge at Laurel Gap in the last of the light. Harold assembled the rifle on a ground sheet in front of everybody, and nobody objected. And Larry, who had lectured us about the regulation at the trailhead, held the flashlight for him. It came at 9, and it came openly. It stood at the edge of our light in the trees on the downhill side, and it did not hide. It was tall. I have argued with Jordan about the height for 2 years, and we have settled on somewhere near 8 feet, though it was never straight. It stood with the spine bent forward, and the head carried low and pushed out ahead of the shoulders. The limbs were wrong in their proportion, the forearms too long, the joints too many. The skin, where there was skin, was the gray of a hide that has been scraped and dried. Above the shoulders it wore a deer skull, not a mask. I want to be honest about what I mean, because the difference is the whole horror of it. A mask sits on a face. This was the front of the head, the actual front, and the bone had grown down into the tissue at the edges in a way that had healed. Harold fired. The report on an open ridge in wet air is a physical thing. It hit us all in the chest. He fired 3 times, and I know at least 2 of them struck, because Jordan found the wound channel on a hemlock trunk behind where it had been standing, and there was matter on the bark that Denise looked at for a long time and would not name. It did not fall. It went backward off the ridge into the black under the trees, and then, from about 200 feet down the slope, it started screaming. It screamed in Harold's voice, his exact voice. It screamed for help, and it used the word please, and it went on for 19 minutes without stopping to breathe. Harold was standing 8 feet away from me the entire time, holding a rifle, listening to himself beg. Beverly talked that night. It was the only way any of us stayed sane, so she talked until the sky went gray. She had grown up hearing it from her grandmother, who had it from a Cherokee woman who had worked in her family's kitchen in the 20s and who had been very clear that she was not telling stories. Beverly said the woman would not use a name for it, because a name is an address. She had rules instead, and Beverly gave us the rules in the order she had learned them, sitting with her back against a tree and her copper-capped stick across her knees. Do not answer when your name is called from outside the light. Do not answer when it is called twice. Do not let it get a long look at your face, and never let it get a long look at your face while you are afraid, because fear is the part it copies best. Do not follow the sound of a person you love. If it takes something of yours, let it have it. And the last one, which she said in a different voice than the others, because she said her grandmother had made her repeat it back 3 times before bed for a whole winter. Never say out loud how many of you there are. At first light, we broke camp and started for Mount Sterling in the tower. Larry did not come. We found his tent zipped from the outside, which is impossible, and his pack still hanging on the bear line, and his boots sitting on the ground at the foot of a hemlock. The boots were placed side by side, laces tucked in, toes pointed at the tree instead of away from it. There was no sign of a struggle in ground so soft that my own knee had left a print an inch deep the night before. There were no prints at all around those boots. Not his, not anything else's. A circle of clean, wet dirt 10 feet across with a pair of boots in the middle of it. Jordan searched for 40 minutes and then made us go. That is the hardest thing I have ever watched a person decide. We climbed the ridge. It called all morning. That is the part I cannot make anyone understand who was not there. It was not stalking us in silence. It talked the entire way, from the slope below and to the left of us, matching our pace exactly, never once showing itself. It used Larry's voice, and it was very good. It said it had fallen. It said it had a broken ankle and it was cold. It said Jordan's name and asked why nobody was coming. Then it would stop for 10 minutes, and then it would start using the sound of a phone ringing, a phone with a specific ringtone, and Tiffany went down on her knees in the trail with both hands over her ears because it was her ringtone, and her phone was in her hand, and it was switched off. We got to the tower at Mount Sterling around 2 in the afternoon. It is a steel fire tower, 60 feet of open lattice on a bald where the campsite sits at almost 6,000 feet, and Beverly was right about it, because from the top you can see everything, and nothing can come at you from cover. We climbed it, all of us, even Harold, 1 rung at a time, with Denise below him and Alicia above, and that was where Denise counted. She did it the way a nurse does, without ceremony, going down the line of us pressed against the railing of that little cab in the wind. Her finger moved, her mouth moved. She got to the end and her face changed, and she started again from the other direction, and I watched her do it a 3rd time before she said anything. There were 8 of us on that tower. Larry Patterson was on the trail below Laurel Gap with his boots pointed at a tree, and there were 8 of us on that tower. Nobody moved. I have never in my life felt a silence with that much weight in it. We were standing shoulder to shoulder in a steel box the size of a small bathroom, 6 feet from each other, in flat gray daylight, and every one of us was doing the arithmetic, and every one of us was afraid to turn our head. Beverly said, without raising her voice at all, "Do not look at each other. Look out. Everybody face out and put your back to the middle." We did. 7 of us turned to the windows and put our backs to the center of that cab, and for 11 seconds nobody breathed. Then Harold said, from behind us, "Well, that is not going to work, is it?" Harold was in front of me. I was looking straight at the back of his neck. I could see the sunburn on it and the strap of his hat. The thing that had spoken from the middle of the room went out through the trapdoor without touching the ladder, and the whole tower rang like a struck bell. We came off that mountain in the last 4 hours of daylight. The Baxter Creek Trail drops 4,200 feet in 6 miles. It is a knee destroyer going down, and it is a lung destroyer coming up, and we did it in a shape that Jordan set and did not let anyone break. 2 people in front, 2 people behind, the middle 4 holding the shoulder straps of the person ahead of them so that nobody could be separated by more than an arm. It walked with us the whole way, not behind, beside. 30 or 40 yards off the trail on the uphill side, keeping our pace exactly, and I saw it 4 times through gaps in the laurel, and every time it was closer to upright than the time before. At about the halfway point it started using my voice. I had not spoken aloud since the tower. It had not heard me speak since the night at Walnut Bottom, when I lay in the tent and did not answer, and I had assumed that meant it did not have me. But it had me. It had me perfectly, down to the way I cannot say the letter S cleanly when I am tired, and it stood off in the trees and called to the group and told them that I had gone ahead and that they should hurry. Denise looked at me. I shook my head. She took my wrist and did not let go for the next 2 miles. We lost Tiffany at the last footlog. There is a bridge low on Baxter Creek where the trail crosses the water on a single split log with a handrail. The creek was still up from the rain and running loud and fast and the color of coffee. We went across one at a time because the log was slick. Tiffany was 6th. She was 3 steps out when she stopped and turned around and looked back up the bank at the rest of us with an expression of complete relief. She said, "Oh, there you are." And she stepped off the log toward something on the upstream bank that 4 of us swear was nothing at all, and that Alicia says, to this day, was a woman in a canvas coat with her head tilted over toward her right shoulder. The water took her. Jordan went in after her, and Jordan is the reason Jordan is alive, because Denise and Harold and I hauled Jordan out by the pack strap 200 feet downstream with a broken collarbone and a face full of gravel. They recovered Tiffany the following afternoon, 1.5 miles down, and the death certificate says drowning, and the death certificate is correct. Larry Patterson was never found. There were 9 days of searching, dogs, a helicopter with thermal, 90 volunteers on grid. They found nothing. They did not even find the boots, and I know exactly where those boots were, and so does Jordan. And we walked 2 rangers to that hemlock and stood on the spot, and the ground was smooth and the leaves were undisturbed. 6 of us came out of Big Creek at 8:15 that evening. There were 8 names in the register at the trailhead in my handwriting, and the park requires you to sign out. I went to the kiosk with a headlamp to do it, because it was my handwriting and it was my job. 2 of the 8 names had already been crossed off. The lines were straight and they were drawn in the same blue ballpoint that hangs on the string at that kiosk, and they went through Larry Patterson and through Tiffany Hughes, and the ink was still tacky when I put my thumb on it. Beverly Long died 14 months later at home in Waynesville, of a stroke, at 86 pounds. She never went into the woods again, and she never once told this story to anybody who had not been there. Alicia Simmons moved to Arizona, where the sight lines are long and there is nothing standing anywhere within a mile of her house. Harold Butler sold the rifle and every other firearm he owned, and if you ask him about that trip, he will tell you he does not remember it, and I have watched his hands while he says it. Jordan Flores went back, twice, alone. Jordan will not tell me what for. Denise Washington still works nights in Knoxville, and she and I speak on the telephone on the 9th of July every year, and we always speak for exactly as long as it takes to say 6 names out loud and confirm that there are 6. As for me, I live in a house on 4 acres with a tree line at the back of the property, 90 feet from my kitchen window. For about a year after, nothing. Then, one evening last October, I was washing dishes with the window open, and I heard a whip poor will start up out past the fence, which is late in the season for it, and it ran 3 notes, 3 notes, 3 notes, then 4, then it stopped in the middle, and a voice out there in the tree line, in the gloom under the pines, said my name in the way Beverly used to say it, with the little lift on the end. It said it once. I did not answer. I turned off the tap and I stood there with my hands in the water and I waited, because the rule is that you have to hear the second one to know. It has been 9 months and it has not said it a second time yet, but it is still out there most nights, and it is patient, and I have started to understand what it is doing. It is not calling me. It is practicing. The backcountry permit is still folded inside my glove compartment, and I have not touched it in 4 years. The paper has gone soft the way paper goes when it lives in heat and cold and heat again. 7 names are printed on it. Only 3 of those names belong to people who are still walking around in the world, and I am not entirely certain about one of them. We were supposed to be gone for 5 nights. That was the plan Carol Watson wrote on the group message thread in April, back when the trip was nothing but a string of cheerful notes and a shared list of gear. 5 nights in Shenandoah National Park, a loop that climbed off the Appalachian Trail and dropped into a drainage that almost nobody walks, because the maintained path pinches out and you have to follow a creek bed for 2 miles before the old fire road picks up again. Carol had done it once before, in her 20s. She said the ridgeline up there held the last of the evening light for a full half-hour after the valley had already gone under, and that you could stand on the rocks and watch the shadow of the mountain crawl east across the farms. She was right about the light. I want to say that first, because almost nothing else I say about that place will sound like a recommendation. There were 7 of us. Carol Watson was 50 and had organized every trip any of us had ever taken together, which meant she carried the maps and the satellite messenger and a small laminated card with everyone's emergency contacts on it. Douglas James was 54 and had been Carol's friend since they worked together at a hardware supply company in Front Royal. Douglas had a way of standing at the edge of a group with his thumbs in his pack straps, saying almost nothing, and then delivering one sentence that reframed the entire conversation. Natalie Ramirez was 35, the strongest hiker among us by a wide margin, and she treated the outdoors like a personal argument she intended to win. Benjamin Brooks was 42 and worked in insurance claims. He brought a folding chair. Everyone made fun of him for the chair, and then everyone borrowed the chair. Judith Kelly was 68. She had hiked more miles than the rest of us put together, and she moved with that slow, economical pace that looks like nothing until you realize she has not stopped once in 3 hours. Judith was the only one of us who had grown up in those mountains, in a hollow south of Elkton, and she carried a set of habits that the rest of us found charming right up until the night we understood they were not habits. They were rules. Charles Sanders was 57 and the only one of us who hunted, though hunting was not what brought him on this particular trip. Shenandoah does not allow it inside the park, and Charles was not the kind of man who bent that. He had come because Carol had asked him, and because his season was still 2 months out and his gear was already packed in his truck from a scouting trip in the George Washington National Forest the week before. He brought a knife that was too large to be sensible and a habit of reading the ground that would matter more than any of us expected. And Brittany Price was 32, on her first real backpacking trip, borrowed pack, borrowed boots, absolutely radiant with the specific joy of a person who has finally gotten out of a city. She took a photograph of the trailhead sign. She took a photograph of all of us under the trailhead sign. I have that photograph. I do not look at it. We parked at the small gravel pullout past mile 40 on Skyline Drive on a Tuesday morning in late July, and the air was already thick enough to chew. Virginia in high summer does not have weather so much as it has a mood. The oaks were heavy and still. The cicadas were running their engine in the canopy in long overlapping waves, and under that there was the finer sound of the ridge, which is water somewhere you cannot see. There was a ranger at the pullout when we arrived, checking a broken signpost. She was young and sunburned and had that particular flat courtesy of someone who has answered the same 6 questions 900 times. Carol showed her the permit. The ranger looked at the route Carol had penciled on the map, and something in her face moved. She asked if we were sticking to the marked trail. Carol said that we were, mostly, but that we intended to take the drainage cut over to the old fire road. The ranger did not say we could not. It is public land, and the route is legal and people do it. What she said was that there had been 3 separate reports in the last month of hikers hearing what they described as somebody calling for help from the drainage, and that each time a patrol went in, they found nothing. She said one party had reported it twice in one night, from 2 different directions. Natalie asked if it might be a fisher cat. She had read about the sound they make. The ranger said fishers are not really a thing that far south, and that whatever it was, the recommendation was that if we heard a person calling for help from off-trail at night, we were to note the time and the direction and report it when we came out, and we were not to go looking. Benjamin laughed and asked if that was official park policy. The ranger did not laugh. She said the official policy was that unaccompanied search efforts by untrained parties create more casualties than they resolve. Then she said, in a different voice, the voice of a person going slightly off script, that she personally would stay on the ridge and not sleep in the drainage. We thanked her, we shouldered our packs, and as we walked away I looked back and saw that she was still standing by the broken signpost, watching us go, and she had not gone back to her work. Judith Kelly had not said anything during that conversation. She had stood a little apart with her hands folded on the top of her trekking poles. When we were maybe a quarter mile up the trail, she came alongside me and asked, quietly, whether Carol was set on the drainage. I said I assumed so. Judith nodded and said, in a voice pitched so that only I could hear it, that it was fine, that it was probably fine, and that we should just make sure we camped high. I asked her what she meant. She said that when she was a girl, her grandmother would not let them keep the windows open on the valley side of the house in August. Not the mountain side, the valley side. And when Judith had asked why, her grandmother had told her that some things come up out of the low ground when it is hot, and that they are curious, and that curiosity is the whole of the danger. I remember laughing, not cruelly. I liked Judith enormously. I laughed the way you laugh at a good ghost story told well, in daylight, with 11 miles of good trail ahead of you and a group of people you love, and the cicadas going, and the light coming down through the oak leaves and coins on the dirt. That is the last honest laugh I have on record. We hiked 7 miles that first day and made camp on the ridge exactly where Judith wanted us, on a bench of flat ground under a stand of chestnut oak with a view east. Charles built the fire. Brittany could not stop taking photographs of the sunset. Carol was right about the light. It held on that ridge long after the valley below had turned the color of wet slate, and we stood in a row on the rocks with our boots off and watched the shadow of our own mountain go running out across the farmland, faster than a person could run, swallowing barns and silos and the little white flecks of houses, until it hit the horizon and the whole world was the same shade. Douglas James said, to nobody, that it was like watching something come untied. Nobody answered him. The cicadas had stopped. I want to be very precise about that, because at the time I did not register it as anything. The cicadas in Shenandoah run in waves through the evening and then taper off after full night, and they had simply stopped early, all of them, at once. And into that hole in the sound came something else, from a long way down the slope, from the low ground where the drainage ran. It was a woman's voice, and it was calling a name. It was too far away to make out the name. It was not close enough to be alarming. It came twice, and then it did not come again. And Carol said somebody was probably looking for a dog, and we all agreed that somebody was probably looking for a dog, and we went and cooked our noodles. Judith Kelly did not eat much that night. She sat facing the downslope with her back to the fire, which is a thing no experienced camper does, because it ruins your night vision from the wrong direction and does nothing for your warmth. She sat like that for a long time. And when I finally crawled into my tent, I heard her say something under her breath, in the tone of a person finishing a prayer or completing a habit. What she said was, "Do not answer it." I assumed she was talking to herself. The second day was the good day. I need to put it down here because if I do not, the whole account becomes nothing but the bad part. And the bad part only means what it means because the good day existed first. We came off the ridge at first light, with the mist still lying in the folds of the mountains in long white ropes. Natalie Ramirez set a pace that Benjamin Brooks complained about for 4 miles and then stopped complaining about, because he had found his rhythm and did not want to break it by talking. We crossed a shoulder of bare rock where the whole eastern half of Virginia opened up under us. We found a spring running cold out of a mossed limestone seam and filled everything we had. Brittany Price saw a black bear at maybe 80 yards, a young one, and it looked at us for 2 seconds and went crashing off downhill through the mountain laurel, and she was so happy about it that she cried a little and then was embarrassed about crying, and Carol Watson hugged her. Charles Sanders spent a lot of that day looking at the ground. I did not notice at first. Charles always looked at the ground. He read tracks the way some people read a newspaper, half attention, constant. But around midday I realized he had fallen back to the rear of the line and was walking with his head down and had not said anything in over an hour. I dropped back and asked him what he had. He said he did not know. I asked what that meant. Charles said that there was a track in the soft ground along the creek crossings, and that it had been there at the first crossing and the second crossing and the fourth, and that at the fourth crossing it was on top of Natalie's boot print, which meant it was behind us and had been behind us all morning. I asked what made it. And Charles Sanders, who had killed and dressed more animals than anyone else on that mountain, who had spent 30 years reading dirt, stood there and worked his jaw and told me he did not know and that he did not like saying that. I asked him to describe it. He said it was about the size of a large deer's front hoof, but split wrong, and the depth was wrong for the weight. Too deep at the toe and almost nothing at the back, like whatever it was had been pushing off hard, over and over, without ever seeming to run. And then he said the part that put a cold wire through my chest. He said that for about 40 feet at the third crossing, the track had gone to 2 prints instead of 4, just for 40 feet. And then back down to 4. I told him that deer do that. They rear up to reach for browse. He said deer rear up. They do not walk. We did not tell the others. I have gone over that decision perhaps 10,000 times since, and I still do not know what telling them at midday would have accomplished except to ruin the last good afternoon any of us would ever have. We were 11 miles from the nearest road in either direction. There was nothing to do with the information. We made camp that second night at the top of the drainage, not down in it. Judith Kelly walked the perimeter of the site before she would set her tent, which we all took for the fussiness of an older hiker. She pushed a stick into the ground at the head of the trail we had come in on and hung her spare bandana on it, red, at about waist height. When Brittany asked her why, Judith said it was so we could find the trail in the mist in the morning. It was not so we could find the trail. I understood that later. Full night came in fast that far down. The ridge had given us that long, slow eastern light, but the drainage head had a wall of mountain to the west, and the sun went behind it at 7, and the world went from gold to gray to nothing in about 20 minutes. Charles built up the fire bigger than he needed to. Nobody asked him why. Around 11, when 4 of us were still up and 3 had gone to their tents, we heard the voice again. This time it was closer. This time we could make out the word. It was calling Carol. I watched Carol Watson's face in the firelight when she heard her own name come up out of the low ground in a woman's voice, thin and stretched and pulled long by distance. She sat completely still. Then she stood up. Judith Kelly came out of her tent so fast that the fly ripped where it caught on her boot, and she said one word, and the word was no. Carol said that somebody down there was in trouble. Judith said that nobody down there was in trouble. Carol said we could not just sit here. And Judith Kelly, 68 years old, 4'11" in her socks, took a fistful of the front of Carol's fleece and pulled her down to eye level and said, very calmly, that the voice knew Carol's name because it had been close enough to hear us use it, and that anything close enough to hear us use it and still far enough away to sound like that was not lost. Nobody moved. The voice called again, Carol, 2 syllables, drawn out, the second one falling, and it was wrong now that I was listening properly. It had no breath in it. When a person shouts across a distance, you hear the air, you hear the push, you hear the little break at the end where the lungs run out. This had none of that. It was the shape of a shout without the machinery of one. It was a recording of a shout played through the wrong speaker. And then it called again, and it was 100 yards to the left of where it had been, and no more than 4 seconds had passed. Natalie Ramirez said, in a very small voice, that it had moved. We put every light we had pointed downslope, 7 headlamps, 2 hand torches, and Charles's big rechargeable spot that he used for tracking, which threw a hard white cone 200 yards. There was mountain laurel down there in a thicket so dense you could not have crawled through it, and above the laurel the trunks of the oaks going up gray and straight, and between the trunks nothing at all, and then something between 2 trunks that was not nothing. It was standing at the very edge of where the spot reached, so far out that the light on it was thin and blue. It was tall. That is the first thing. It was tall in a way that made me recalculate the size of the trees, because my brain first said deer and then said the deer is 9 feet at the shoulder, and then rejected the whole reading and started over. It was standing on 2 legs, and the legs bent backward at the knee like a dog's hind leg, and the head was long and narrow and low, and there was something on the head that had been antlers once, but had been broken or worn down to 2 blunt stumps. It did not have eyes that caught the light. That is the detail I still cannot get past. Every animal in the woods throws your headlamp back at you, green or gold or red, the tapetum firing. Deer light up like coins. This thing had 2 spots on its head where the light went in and did not come out, and they were fixed on us. Charles Sanders held the spot on it for maybe 3 seconds. Then it turned, and the turn was wrong. It did not pivot. The head went first, all the way around, and the body followed after, and there was a moment in the middle where the head was facing us, and the shoulders were facing away. Then it was gone, not running, gone, the way a hand goes when you close a door on it. Brittany Price began to make a noise that was not quite screaming. Benjamin Brooks got her into a tent. Nobody slept. Charles sat up with the spot in his lap and the fire high and his back against a tree, and I sat with him, and Judith Kelly sat with us, and around 2 a.m. Judith started talking. She said her grandmother had a word for it and that she was not going to say the word, because saying the word out loud is how you tell it that you know what it is, and it takes that as an invitation. She said the rules were simple and old, and that we would think they were foolish, and that she did not care. Do not answer it when it calls. Do not call out any of our names after nightfall. Do not go toward it, ever, for any reason, no matter whose voice it uses. I asked her what happens if you go toward it. Judith Kelly looked at the fire for a long moment and said that when she was 9 years old, a man named Everett Cobb went out of his back door at night because he heard his own son calling from the tree line, and his son was asleep upstairs in the bed the whole time, and they found Everett 3 days later at the bottom of a rock slide 11 miles away with every one of his fingers broken and his boots on the wrong feet. We broke camp at first light, all of us, without discussion. There was no argument about aborting the loop. Carol had the satellite messenger out and was trying to compose a message that did not sound like a person having a breakdown, because a distress signal brings a helicopter, and a helicopter costs somebody a great deal of money, and there is a certain kind of person who would rather be eaten than be embarrassed. She settled on a message saying that the party was returning to the trailhead early due to a wildlife encounter and would be out by evening. She never got confirmation that it sent. The screen kept searching. We were down in the drainage head with mountain on 3 sides. Douglas James was the one who noticed the tents. There were 7 tents. 6 of them were where they had been. Douglas's tent, which he had pitched at the northern edge nearest the Laurel, had been moved, not collapsed, not dragged. Moved and set up again, 20 feet to the north, facing the other way, with the stakes properly seated in the ground and the guy lines tensioned correctly. Douglas had slept in it all night. He stood looking at his own tent standing neatly in the wrong place, and he said, in that flat, quiet way he had, that something had pulled the stakes on all 4 corners with him inside it and he had not woken up. Nobody had an answer for that. We went out fast. Natalie Ramirez broke trail. Judith Kelly's red bandana was still on the stick at the head of the path, and we went past it in single file, and I was the 4th in the line, and as I passed it I saw that the bandana had been retied. Judith had tied it in a simple overhand knot. It was now tied in a bow. I did not say anything. I have to live with that. The route out was the way we had come, which meant 3 creek crossings and then a long climb up the shoulder and then the ridge and then 8 miles of good trail. We made the first crossing by 8 in the morning. The mist was still down and thick, the kind of Appalachian summer fog that turns 40 feet into the edge of the world, and everything in it was the color of a wet nickel. Sound behaves badly in that fog. It arrives without a direction attached. At the second crossing we lost Douglas. I want to be careful with the word lost. We did not turn around and find him missing. We heard him. We were spread out over maybe 200 feet of creek bed, going one at a time over a fallen tulip poplar that spanned the water, and Douglas had gone across 3rd and had walked ahead about 40 yards to scout the far bank. That was all. 40 yards. Carol was crossing. I was waiting. And out of the fog upstream, well off from where Douglas had gone, came Douglas's voice. It said, "Hey, come look at this." 4 words. His exact cadence. The slightly nasal thing his voice did on the vowel in look. Charles Sanders was standing next to me, and he put his hand flat on my chest, hard, like a man stopping a car door. Because at the exact same moment, from directly ahead of us, from the far bank where he had actually gone, Douglas James called out and asked whether we wanted to stop here or push on to the shoulder. 2 of him, at the same time, from 2 directions. Judith Kelly behind me said, quietly, to keep walking and to look at nobody and to say nothing. We got Carol across. We got Brittany across, and she was shaking so badly that Natalie had to hold her arm the whole way, and the log was slick and it took a long time. And the whole time we were doing that, the thing upstream kept talking in Douglas's voice. It said, "Hey, come look at this." Then it said, "Hey, come look at this." Then it said it again and again, 12 or 15 times, exactly the same length, exactly the same pitch, with exactly the same pause between each repetition, the way a machine repeats and a person never does. It was not calling to us. It was practicing. And then it stopped, and it said, in Douglas's voice, "Do you want to stop here or push on to the shoulder?" It had learned the new one. We got to the far bank. Douglas James was standing there with his thumbs in his pack straps, looking upstream into the fog with an expression I had never seen on him, and he asked us, very quietly, whether that had been him. Nobody answered. We climbed. The shoulder was a 900-foot gain over about 1.25 miles, all of it on loose rock through a burn scar from a fire 6 years back, which meant no canopy and no shade, and the fog burning off into a white glare as the sun came up over the ridge. We were badly strung out. Natalie and Charles were up front, Carol and Brittany in the middle. Benjamin was struggling, and Judith stayed with him. Douglas and I brought up the rear. Douglas talked the whole way up. He had never talked that much in the entire time I knew him. He talked about his daughter in Richmond, and about a boat he had almost bought in 2011, and about how he had been in that hardware supply job for 19 years and had meant to leave in year 3. I understood, even then, that he was talking so he could hear his own voice come out of his own mouth and be sure of where it was. 2/3 of the way up he stopped and turned around and looked back down the burn scar. I asked him what he saw. He said nothing, and he said it in a way that meant something, and we kept climbing. At the top of the shoulder there is a small flat spot where the burn scar ends and the oaks start again, and Natalie and Charles were waiting there with the packs off and water out. We came in one at a time. Carol, Brittany, Judith, Benjamin, gray in the face and sitting down harder than he meant to, then me, and then nobody. Douglas James had been 11 feet behind me. There was one switchback between the flat spot and the last place I had seen him, on open ground, on bare rock, with no cover taller than my knee for 200 yards in any direction, in full daylight, at 10:40 in the morning. We searched for 4 hours. We went down the burn scar 3 times. Charles quartered the whole slope. We shouted until Brittany's voice gave out entirely, and I know what Judith had said about not calling names after nightfall, but it was daylight and he was our friend, and we called his name until the sun went over. We found his water bottle at the base of the last switchback, standing upright, capped, set neatly on a flat rock. We never found anything else. We could not go on, and we could not stay. The trailhead was still 8 miles of ridge away, and the light was failing, and Benjamin Brooks was in no condition to move fast. Carol tried the satellite messenger from the top of the shoulder, and this time it got a signal, and she sent the distress. The response came back that a ground team would be dispatched at first light, and that we were to shelter in place and remain together. Shelter in place, remain together. I have thought about those 5 words a great deal. We made a camp that was not a camp. We put 4 tents in a tight square on the flat spot with the doors facing in, and we built a fire in the middle so big that Charles had to break up a fallen limb with the back of a hatchet to feed it. Nobody set up on the edges. Nobody went out of the light for any reason. Brittany Price would not stop apologizing, over and over, for being afraid, and Carol held on to her and told her that being afraid was the correct response, and that anyone not afraid was not paying attention. Judith Kelly walked the perimeter again. This time she did not pretend it was about trail markers. She took a small tin of something out of her pack, something granular and gray that she did not explain, and she laid a thin line of it around the 4 tents. And she said an old thing under her breath in a rhythm that was not quite a song. And when she was done, she sat down and put her hands over her face and stayed like that for a while. Natalie Ramirez asked her, without any mockery at all, whether that would work. Judith said it had worked for her grandmother's house for 61 years, and that she did not know if it worked, and that those were 2 different statements, and she meant both of them. It came at 9:40. It started with the crying. It was Douglas. It was Douglas James crying, out beyond the firelight, somewhere north, and it was not the shape of a shout this time. It was close, and it had breath in it. It sounded like a 54-year-old man who had been in the woods alone for 11 hours with a broken leg and had finally seen a light through the trees. He said, "Please." He said, "I can see you." He said, "I can see the fire, please, my leg. I cannot stand up." Benjamin Brooks got up. Charles Sanders put him back down on the ground so fast and so hard that it looked like an assault, and Benjamin fought him, actually fought him, swinging with closed fists, screaming into Charles's face that it was Douglas out there, that we were going to sit here and let him die. And Judith Kelly said, loud enough to cut through it, that she was going to tell us how she knew. We all went quiet, even Benjamin. Judith said that Douglas James had a stutter when he was tired, not a bad one, on hard consonants, at the end of a long day, when his guard was down. She said she had hiked behind that man for 3 days and heard it a dozen times, and that anyone who had been listening had heard it too. She said the thing in the woods was crying and begging and had been going for 4 minutes and had not stuttered once, because it had only ever heard Douglas talking at the beginning of the day. Benjamin Brooks stopped fighting and lay on the ground and made a sound I do not want to describe. It went on for 2 hours. I need you to understand what that means. Not 2 hours of noise. 2 hours of a friend of ours pleading, changing tactics, getting angry, going quiet, coming back, sobbing, saying our names one at a time, saying Carol's name, saying Natalie's name, saying my name, saying that he could see us sitting there, saying that he could see us sitting there and not coming, and asking why, and asking why, and asking why. At some point it began circling. You could track it by the sound. It went around us at a distance of maybe 60 yards, and it never once crossed in front of anything that would have let us see it, and every time it passed the northern arc it stopped and tried again. At around midnight it changed. The voice went up in pitch, right in the middle of a sentence, and became Brittany Price's voice, and Brittany was sitting 3 feet from me with both hands over her mouth. Then it became Natalie's. Then it became a child's voice, a small girl, calling for her mother, and Carol Watson made a sound like she had been struck, because Carol has a daughter, and that daughter is grown now, but there was a version of that girl at 7 years old, and the thing outside had found it somewhere. It was going through us. That is what it felt like something turning over the contents of a drawer. And then, near 3 in the morning, it stopped completely, and the woods went silent in the way they had gone silent on the first night, all at once, and something walked into the edge of the firelight. It came in on all fours, and then it stood up. At the ridge camp it had been 150 yards out and thin and blue in the beam. This was 15 feet away, in orange light. The proportions were the thing. Everything about it was almost. The hind legs were almost a deer's. The shoulders were almost a man's, too high and too narrow, and the skin over them was gray and loose and had hair on it in patches the way a sick animal has hair. The forelimbs came down too far, past where the knee should have been, and the hands, and they were hands, had too many joints in the fingers, and the fingers were bent backward at the last one. The head was long and pushed forward and low on the neck, and it had those 2 stumps of antler worn to nothing, and the mouth did not close all the way, and there were no eyes. There were 2 openings where eyes go, and inside them there was nothing, no shine, no wet, no reflection at all, only a depth that the firelight went into and did not come back out of. It stood there and it looked at us, and it did not breathe. And then it said, in Judith Kelly's voice, perfectly, without a single flaw, that it was so cold out here. Judith Kelly stood up. She walked toward the line of gray powder she had laid on the ground, and she stopped just inside it, 4 feet from that thing, an old woman in a fleece jacket and untied boots, and she raised her chin, and she said something to it in a language I did not know, 3 or 4 words, and it was not a plea, and it was not a prayer. It was the tone a person uses on a dog that has come into the kitchen. The thing took 1 step backward. Then it turned that head all the way around, and the body followed, and it went into the trees. And Judith Kelly sat back down and said, without turning around, that we should not think for 1 second that it had gone. The ground team reached us at 9:20 the next morning, 4 of them, and the first thing I felt when I saw their uniforms coming up the trail was not relief. It was a kind of animal shame, because I understood that in about 90 seconds I was going to have to start describing this out loud to people who were paid to be reasonable. Benjamin Brooks had a bad night. He had not slept in 2 days, and he had watched a person he loved get put on the ground to stop him from running into the trees, and by morning he had gone somewhere behind his own face. He answered questions. He walked when we told him to walk. He did not say anything unprompted for the next 11 hours. We reported Douglas as missing at the base of the burn scar switchback at approximately 10:40 the previous morning. We reported the water bottle. Charles walked one of them down to the exact rock, and it was still there, still capped, still standing upright. We did not report the rest of it. Not then. We had agreed, in a short and miserable conversation at dawn, that we would say we had heard sounds, that the group had been badly frightened by wildlife, and that we had held position. Every one of us understood what happens to a missing person search when the witnesses start using words that make a coordinator quietly reclassify them. Judith Kelly did not agree to that. She told them everything, every word of it, standing there in the burn scar in the morning sun, calmly, in order, like a person reading out a receipt. One of the team wrote it all down, His face did not change. When she was finished, he thanked her and asked her to sign the statement, and he was kind about it, and that kindness was the most humiliating thing I have ever witnessed. They walked us out. 8 miles of ridge trail in full daylight with 4 trained people and radios and a helicopter that came over twice. It should have been the safest 8 miles of my life. At mile 3, something paced us. I do not know if the ground team heard it. I know Charles heard it, because he stopped looking at the trail and started looking at the slope below us and did not stop for the next 5 miles. It stayed downhill of us, 40 or 50 yards below the trail line in the laurel, and it did not make a sound of footfalls, and the only reason I knew it was there was the birds. There is a band of noise that moves along with you in those mountains in July. Ours had a hole in it, and the hole stayed exactly level with us the entire way. At mile 6 it called out once, in Douglas James's voice, and asked us to wait. Nobody stopped. Nobody said anything. Brittany Price put both hands over her ears and kept walking, and one of the team put a hand between her shoulder blades and kept her moving. We came out at the pullout at 4 in the afternoon. There were 2 vehicles and a folding table and a woman with a clipboard. The trailhead sign was still there, the one Brittany had photographed with all 7 of us underneath it, 4 days and about 900 years earlier. They searched for Douglas James for 19 days. Dogs, a helicopter with thermal, 140 volunteers at peak, a grid across 4 square miles. The dogs would not work the burn scar. That is in the record. 2 separate handlers noted that their animals refused to take the scent article past the second switchback, and one of them wrote the word balked, and one of them wrote something less professional that got edited out of the final report. They never found him. He is still listed. Every so often somebody posts about him in a forum for missing persons cases in the national parks, and there is always a person in the replies who says, the terrain is steep and the laurel is thick, and people are found 10 years later, 400 yards from where they vanished. And that person is being perfectly reasonable, and I never reply. Here is what happened to the rest of us. Carol Watson does not go into the woods anymore. She sold every piece of gear she owned in one weekend, and she runs on paved surfaces now, in town, in the morning, and she and I speak twice a year on the phone about nothing. Natalie Ramirez went back. 4 months later, alone, in November, with a rented satellite phone and a camera, and she walked the drainage for 2 days. She has never told me what she was looking for, and she has never told me whether she found it. What she told me is that she is finished with that place, and that she wishes she had gone in summer, and when I asked her why, she said because in November the cicadas are already gone, and so you cannot tell. Brittany Price moved to Oregon. She is doing well. She sent me a photograph 2 years ago of herself on a beach, and she looked genuinely happy, and I was glad in a way that hurt. Benjamin Brooks was hospitalized for 6 weeks that autumn. He is all right now, mostly. He will tell you himself that he is not the same, and he says it without much weight, the way you would mention a knee that aches before rain. What he cannot do is hear a person call his name from another room. His wife texts him instead. Charles Sanders sold his rifles, all of them, a man who had hunted since he was 11 years old. He told me once, at Judith's kitchen table, that he had spent his whole life understanding that he was the most dangerous thing in any patch of woods he stood in, and that this understanding was not a belief. It was the floor he stood on, and that he had gone up that mountain with it and come down without it, and he did not know how to be in the trees without it. Judith Kelly died 3 years ago, at 75, at home, in the hollow south of Elkton, in her sleep, which is the only merciful thing in this entire account. I drove down for the service. Afterward, her niece gave me a small tin, the gray granular one, and said Judith had left instructions that it go to me and that I would know what it was for. I do not know what it is for, but it is in my house. I have never gone back to Shenandoah. I understand that this is not rational. Shenandoah is 200,000 acres. 2 million people go through it every year, and they see waterfalls and bears and the most beautiful sunsets in the eastern United States, and they come home, and they are fine. And the overwhelming majority of them will never hear anything in the low ground at night except an owl. But there is one thing that I have not been able to put down, and it is the reason I am telling this at all. 8 months after we came out, Carol got a phone call at 2 in the morning from a number that did not exist, not a spoofed number, not a wrong number. A string of digits with too few digits in it, according to her carrier, who told her that it could not have happened and then could not explain the entry on her own bill. She answered it. Of course she answered it. It was 2 a.m, and she had been waiting 19 days and then 8 months for a phone to ring. She said there was no static and no sound of a room. She said there was no sound of breathing. And then a voice said, "Hey, come look at this." And it stuttered on the hard consonant, the way he did when he was tired. Carol called me at 2:11 a.m. and told me all of it in one breath, and then asked me the question that she has never once asked me again. And I want to put the question down here and then stop, because I have never had an answer, and I have come to understand that the absence of the answer is the whole of it. She asked me whether that meant he was alive, or whether it meant that after all those months, it had finally learned. There is an audio file on my phone that I have never been able to delete. It is 4 minutes and 11 seconds long. For the first 3 minutes you hear nothing except wind moving through summer leaves and the small clatter of camp cookware. Then, at 3 minutes and 9 seconds, you hear a woman laugh. It is a warm laugh, a little breathless at the end. The laugh of somebody who has just been told a joke she has heard before and loves anyway. The woman who made that laugh was standing beside me when it played back. She heard it too. She went the color of old paper and asked me, very quietly, to turn it off, because she had not laughed once that entire day. That was the second afternoon. I want to start earlier than that, on the first afternoon, when we were still 8 people who believed the worst thing that could happen to us was rain. We came into Shenandoah on a Thursday in the middle of July, when the Blue Ridge was so green it looked wet, even in full sun. 8 of us, 3 vehicles, a plan that had taken 4 months of group messages to assemble. The idea belonged to Douglas James, who was 54 years old and had been coming to these mountains since he was a boy, and who talked about the hollows the way other men talk about houses they grew up in. He knew the old names. He knew which streams ran even in a dry August. He was the reason we were not going to any of the places the guidebooks recommend. The others were a collection assembled out of 2 decades of overlapping lives. Natalie Ramirez, 35, who had organized every detail of the food and the permits, and who could not sit still for longer than 10 minutes. Carol Watson, 50, who taught middle school history and who had spent the drive reading aloud from a printed page about mountain families relocated when the park was created in the 1930s. Benjamin Brooks, 42, quiet, precise, a man who packed his gear in labeled bags and who once drove 90 miles to return a borrowed tent pole. Judith Kelly, 68, widowed 2 years, small and tough as a hickory root, who had outwalked all of us on a trip to the Adirondacks and never once mentioned it afterward. Charles Sanders, 57, who had hunted these ridges and the national forest land to the west since before some of us were born, and who carried a rifle for the section of the trip that would take us outside park boundaries. And Brittany Price, 32, the youngest, who filmed everything, who narrated her own life into a phone screen, and who was funnier than any of us deserved. And me. I was there because Douglas asked, and because I had spent 11 years saying no to things, and because that summer I had decided to stop. We left the vehicles at a pull-off near Skyline Drive and walked down into the hollow with everything on our backs. Douglas led. The trail was faint and old, more a suggestion than a path, and it went down along a stream through a tunnel of rhododendron so thick the light came through green. Carol kept stopping to point at things. A rock wall running for 40 yards through the woods, where somebody had once cleared a field. A rusted stove door lying in the leaves. A stand of apple trees gone wild and scrubby, still bearing hard little fruit. All that was left of an orchard that had fed a family for 4 generations. People lived here, she kept saying. Right here. Somebody's mother stood right here. 800 families, Douglas said, give or take, bought out and moved off when the park came in. Some of them went willing. Some of them did not. Brittany had her phone up, walking backward, filming the hollow. So this is basically a ghost town with trees on it. Something like that. I remember the exact moment the day changed, and I remember it because at the time it did not feel like anything. We were maybe 2 miles in. Benjamin had stopped ahead of us on the trail with his hand up, the way you do when you see wildlife and you do not want to spook it. A deer stood on the far bank of the stream, 40 feet away, watching us. It was a doe, and it was large. Larger than it should have been, though at the time I told myself that deer look bigger when you are close to them and there is nothing around for scale. She stood in the water up to her knees, and she did not run, and she did not eat, and she did not flick her ears. She simply looked at us. And the longer she looked, the more I understood that something in the arrangement of her face was wrong. Her eyes were set too far forward. Deer have eyes on the sides of their heads, because they are prey, because they need to see the whole world at once. This animal had eyes that faced us both at the same time, eyes that held us the way a person holds you across a room. Charles moved up beside me. He had hunted whitetail every season for 40 years. I watched him look at the animal, and I watched something happen in his face that I did not have a word for yet. "Back away," he said. He said it quietly, without any drama at all, and that was the part that frightened me. "Everybody, back up the trail. Slow." "It is a deer," Brittany said, still filming. "Back up." We backed up. The doe watched us go. She did not move at all, not one muscle, not for as long as I could see her, and I kept looking over my shoulder until the rhododendron closed behind us. 20 minutes later, on higher ground, Charles finally spoke again. He said that in 40 years he had never seen an animal fail to blink. "Not once," he said. "In 4 minutes." Judith, who had said nothing at all during any of it, said something then that stayed with me for the rest of my life. She said her husband had grown up in Page County, on the western side of these mountains, and that his grandmother had rules about the woods. One of them was that if an animal in the forest looks at you like it knows your name, you do not look back, and you do not speak, and above all you do not answer it. Benjamin laughed. It was a nervous, unconvincing sound. Nobody else laughed at all. We made camp that night in a clearing Douglas knew, on a flat bench of ground above the stream where an old home site had been. There was a chimney still standing, a column of hand-stacked fieldstone with a hearth at the bottom of it, and a square depression in the earth where the floor had been. Carol was so delighted she nearly cried. The evening was ordinary. That is the thing I would ask you to hold on to. It was completely and beautifully ordinary. We cooked, we ate. Brittany filmed the chimney and made up a voice for the family that had lived there. Natalie hung the food bags. Judith went to bed early, and Charles and Douglas sat up with the fire talking about ridge lines. I fell asleep listening to the stream. I woke at some hour with no name, in that total lightless quiet, because somewhere down the hollow a child was crying. The crying was thin and far away, and it did not stop. I lay in my sleeping bag with my heart going, and I told myself the things you tell yourself. Fox, bobcat, some bird I did not know. The woods are full of sounds that imitate distress, and every experienced camper has a story about the first time a fox screamed at 2 a.m. and took 10 years off their life. But a fox screams and then it stops. This did not stop. It went on with the terrible patience of something that had nowhere else to be, rising and falling, wet and hitching, exactly the way a small child cries when it has been crying long enough to be exhausted by it. I heard a zipper, then boots, then Natalie's voice outside my tent, low. "Are you hearing this?" "Yes." "Is that a kid?" "No," I said, and I had no reason on earth to be certain, and I was certain. 6 of us ended up standing in the clearing with headlamps off, because Douglas said the light would only ruin our eyes. Judith stayed in her tent. Charles had his rifle across his arms and was standing with his head tilted, the way a man listens to an engine he does not like the sound of. The crying moved. That was what broke something in me. It had been down the hollow to the south, and over the space of perhaps 10 minutes it traveled to the east, and then it was above us on the slope, and it never once passed through the space in between. It did not walk. It simply was in one place, and then it was in another, and it was closer. "That is a person," Carol whispered. "That is a lost child, and we are standing here." "That is not a child," Charles said. "You do not know that." "Carol." His voice was absolutely level. "There is no road within 4 miles. There is no trailhead. It is 2 a.m. The crying stopped. The silence that replaced it was not the ordinary silence of a summer night in the mountains. The insects had quit. The stream was still going, but it sounded far away and unimportant, the way sound does when you have water in your ears. We stood in that dead air for a long moment. Then, from the shadow of the trees maybe 60 yards up the slope, a voice said Carol's name. It said it the way you would say it to somebody you loved. 2 soft syllables with a lift at the end. Carol made a sound I had never heard a grown woman make. She said, "That is Ray." Ray was her brother. Ray had died of an aneurysm in a parking lot in Roanoke 5 years earlier. "Do not answer," Judith said. None of us had heard her come out. She was standing at the door of her tent in a gray sweatshirt with her arms folded, and she was looking up the slope, and she was not frightened. She was something worse than frightened. She looked like a woman confirming a thing she had hoped she would never have to confirm. "Nobody answers it," she said. "Not one word. It has to learn your voice, and it learns it by getting you to use it." The voice said Carol's name again. Closer, then it said it in Douglas's voice, then in mine. "I want you to understand what that is like. To stand in the lightless woods and hear your own voice, your own exact voice, with every crack and habit of it, come out of the trees where nothing is standing, saying a woman's name with love in it." Benjamin sat down on the ground. He did not faint. He simply sat, hard, like his legs had been switched off. Charles raised the rifle and put the muzzle toward the slope and did not fire. He told me afterward that he could not find anything to aim at, and that this was not because it was too shadowed to see. He said the shape was there. He said it was standing between two oaks in plain view, at least 7 feet of it, narrow, wrong in the joints, and that every time he tried to settle the sights on it, his eyes would slide off it, the way your hand slides off wet glass. The voice tried 4 more names. It got Brittany's mother. It got a man Natalie had not spoken to in 11 years. It never got mine right, and I have spent a long time wondering why. And then, about an hour before first light, it went away. We felt it go. The insects came back all at once, a wall of sound, and the night became a night again, and we all stood there shaking in the sudden ordinariness of it. Nobody slept. At dawn we broke camp in about 11 minutes. Here is what I need you to know about the next part, because everything else follows from it. We tried to leave. We went up the hollow the way we had come in, all 8 of us, moving fast, following the stream because the stream had to lead out. Douglas had walked this ground for 40 years. He had a map and a compass, and he had done this since he was 9 years old. We walked for 4 hours, and we came back to the chimney. We did it again with Charles navigating and Natalie counting paces, and it took 5 hours, and we came back to the chimney from the opposite direction, which is not a thing that geography permits. I watched Douglas James stand in that clearing with the compass in his open palm and his mouth working and nothing coming out of it, and I watched a 54-year-old man realize that the mountain he had loved his entire life was holding the door shut. Carol Watson went missing on the 3rd evening. She had been the worst of us since the voice. She had not slept in 2 nights, and she had stopped eating, and she kept saying that it had sounded so much like him, that it had gotten the thing right that nobody could get right, the way he said her name with the second half swallowed. She said it over and over. Natalie sat with her for hours. We had rules by then. Judith had given them to us, and we followed them, because Judith was the only person in that hollow who was not improvising. Nobody goes anywhere alone. Nobody answers a voice from the trees, not even if it is somebody standing right next to you, not until you have looked at them with your own eyes. Nobody says another person's name out loud after sundown. Nobody looks directly at it if it comes, and nobody, under any circumstances, invites anything into a tent. Judith knew these rules from her husband, who had them from his grandmother, who had lived in a hollow 11 miles from where we were standing until the government bought her out in 1935. Judith said the old woman had never called the thing by a name. She said naming it was the same as calling it. She said the families up here had 100 small habits built around it: salt on the sill, a knife under the step, never whistling after sundown, and that when the park came and the families went, all that knowledge walked out of these mountains in the back of a truck. It was here before us, Judith said. It watched a lot of people leave. I think it has been very hungry and very bored. She told us other things while we sat around a fire we kept far too large. She said the families in these hollows had understood something that the rest of the country had forgotten, which is that a wild place is not empty. She said her husband's grandmother had explained it to her exactly one time, in a kitchen in Page County in 1979, while snapping beans into a bowl and refusing to make eye contact with the window. The old woman had said that there is a thing in these mountains that has no shape of its own. She said it had been here longer than the families, longer than the people the families had taken the land from, longer than the chestnut trees that used to cover every ridge before the blight came through. She said it does not hunt the way a bear hunts. It has no hurry. It will spend a week learning a household the way a student learns a lesson, standing outside in the gloom night after night, listening through the boards, until it knows how a husband coughs and how a mother calls her children in, and which child answers first. And then, the old woman said, it comes to the door in a shape you love. Judith told us the rules had all been built around that one fact. Salt on the sill because it will not step over. A knife in the ground under the step because it does not like worked iron. Never say the names of your own family out loud in the open after sundown, because a name spoken aloud is a gift, and it keeps every gift it is given. Never whistle, because whistling is answering. And if it calls to you in the voice of somebody who is buried, you are to understand that you are not being visited. You are being fitted for something. Benjamin asked what happens to the people who go. Judith looked at the fire for a while before she answered. She said that in 89 years, the old woman had known of 4 people from that hollow who walked into the trees after a voice. She said 3 of them were never found at all. She said the 4th came back. Came back how? Natalie said. Came back 6 days later, Judith said. Walked up onto the porch in the middle of the afternoon. Same clothes, not a scratch on him. And his mother took one look at him through the screen and shut the door, and locked it, and would not open it again. Not for 1 hour, not for the whole rest of her life, and he stood out there in the yard calling to her in his own voice until it got shadowed, and then he was not there anymore. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Brittany said, quietly, "How did she know?" She said he stood wrong, Judith said. She said her boy had a way of standing with his weight on his left leg, and this one did not. She said everything else was perfect. I looked around that fire at 7 faces I had known for years, and for the first time in my life I found myself doing an inventory. The way Douglas cleared his throat, the way Natalie bounced her heel, the way Benjamin lined up the corners of things. Small, useless facts I had never once had a reason to notice. I have never stopped doing that inventory. Not with anyone. Not since. Carol slipped away between 2 of us at dusk while we were arguing about water. 1 minute she was sitting on a log with her boots off. The next minute the log was empty and her boots were still there. We found her at the wild orchard. It took 40 minutes, and we found her because Brittany saw movement between the scrubby apple trees in the last of the light. Carol was standing in the middle of that ruined orchard with her bare feet in the leaf litter, facing away from us, and she was talking. She was having a conversation. Pauses in the right places. Small laughs. The particular relaxed cadence of a person catching up with family. There was nothing in front of her but a gap between 2 apple trees. Douglas started forward and Judith caught his arm with a strength that surprised all of us and said no. "Carol," Natalie called. "Carol, come here, come to me." Carol turned her head and she smiled at us over her shoulder and she said, "It is all right. It is only Ray. He has been waiting so long." And then something came out of the gap between the trees. I have had 11 years to build a description, and I have never gotten past the first sentence, which is that it was too tall and it was assembled wrong. It came out low and folded, the way a spider comes out of a drain, and then it rose, and it kept rising, and the rising took longer than it had any right to. Its arms were long enough that its hands hung near its shins. There was hide on it, patchy and gray, and under the hide the shape of a rib cage that belonged to something that ran on 4 legs, and it had a face. The face was the part that broke Benjamin permanently. It had a human face, and it was not a stranger's face, and it was not Ray's face. It was Carol's. It wore her face on the front of its head like a mask cut from a photograph, slack and too large, the mouth hanging open in an expression she was making at the same time, and when Carol smiled at us over her shoulder, the thing smiled with her at the same instant, exactly. Then it took her. It did not drag her. That is the detail I have never been able to put down. It reached out and put one long hand flat against her back, gently, the way you guide a friend through a doorway, and it walked her into the trees, and she went with it. She was still talking. Her voice got quieter and quieter, and it never once changed its tone. Charles fired twice. He is the only one of us who did anything at all, and he swore afterward that he hit it, and there was no sound of impact and nothing fell. We ran. We ran the wrong way, and it did not matter, because every way was the wrong way, and at some point in full lightlessness we came out at the stone chimney, which by then I had begun to think of not as a campsite but as the center of a plate we were being served on. Brittany was hyperventilating. Benjamin was saying Carol's name over and over, and Judith put her hand over his mouth and held it there until he stopped. That was the night we tried to keep a watch, and learned what the watch was actually for. We built the fire up until it was a bonfire, and we sat with our backs to it in a ring facing outward, which is the position every animal on this earth arrives at eventually. Charles had 11 rounds left, and he counted them twice out loud. Natalie made everybody drink water. Judith walked a circle around the whole camp, pouring a line of salt from the cooking supplies, and not one person made a joke about it, and I think that is the moment I understood how far we had already traveled from the people who had walked down into that hollow. It came at some point after midnight, and it did not come the way it had come before. It began with Carol calling for help. Her voice came from up the slope, hoarse and cracked and absolutely desperate, saying that she was hurt, that her leg was broken, that she had been walking for hours and she could see our fire and please, would somebody come. Benjamin stood up. Natalie got both arms around him and I got the other side of him, and we put him on the ground and held him there while he fought us. And he was not a large man, but he was very strong for about 40 seconds. And the whole time Carol's voice went on and on above us, getting more frightened, describing the fire, describing the chimney, describing the color of Natalie's jacket. Then it began to cry. Then it began to beg. Then, when none of us moved, the tone of it changed. And this is the part I have never been able to explain to anyone who was not there. The voice stayed exactly the same, and the thing behind the voice stopped pretending. It kept saying the words, "Please, help me. I am so cold." But it said them flatly, without any feeling at all, the way a person reads a shopping list, and it kept saying them for 2 full hours without ever pausing to breathe. Benjamin Brooks lay on the ground with his hands over his ears and wept. Toward the end, it stood at the edge of the salt line. I never saw it. I only know because Judith was facing that direction and she went very still, and because at about 4 in the morning something out beyond the light said, in Carol Watson's voice, "That is a fine line of salt, honey," and laughed. At first light it was gone again, and we had learned 2 things. The first was that Judith's rules worked. The second was that it now knew exactly how much they were worth, and that it had all the time in the world. We buried the rest of that day in small tasks, because moving was better than sitting. And at dusk, Douglas James went out of the ring of firelight to be sick, and came back changed. He was gone perhaps 90 seconds. When he stepped back into the light, he looked exactly like Douglas. Same shirt with the torn pocket, same boots, same gray in the beard. He sat down on the same rock he had been sitting on, and he put his hands out toward the fire, and he said, "Sorry about that." And every single one of us knew, I cannot tell you how. There was nothing to point at. I have gone over it 1,000 times looking for the tell, and the honest answer is that the tell was not in him. It was in us. It was the way an animal knows. The hair on my arm stood up and my mouth went dry, and some part of my brain that is older than language stood up and started screaming at me to be still. Natalie was closest to him. I watched her go absolutely rigid. "Douglas," Judith said pleasantly, "would you pass me that green bag?" There were 2 bags by his feet. Neither was green. He picked one up and handed it to her without looking. Judith took it. She said, "Thank you." And then, in exactly the same warm and unhurried tone, she said, "Everybody stand up. We are going to walk to the water. We are not going to run." We stood up. The thing wearing Douglas stood up with us. We walked. It walked with us, in the middle of the group, matching our pace, making conversation. It talked about a fishing trip in 1998. It got details right. It got Douglas's laugh right, and his habit of clearing his throat before a punchline, and the way he mispronounced one particular word. Brittany was walking directly behind it. She was filming. I do not know if she was thinking clearly or if the phone was just something to hold on to. She told me later, in the only conversation we ever had about that night, that on the screen it did not look like Douglas at all. She said the camera did not agree with her eyes. She said in the screen there was a tall gray thing with its arms hanging down, walking with us, wearing a face like a wet paper bag. She made a sound. It stopped walking. It turned around to face her, and it did it wrong. Its feet did not move. The body rotated at the waist, all the way, 180 degrees, with a sound like a wet rope being twisted. And it said in Douglas's voice, "What are you filming, sweetheart?" Charles shot it in the chest from 6 feet away. There is a part of me that will always be grateful to Charles Sanders. He was 57 years old, and he had never fired a weapon at a living thing that was not game, and he did not hesitate. The thing folded backward at an angle no spine allows, and it went into the trees, and it screamed. I have read that the closest thing on this earth is a bull elk in rut, and that is a comparison made by people who have not heard this. It was not one voice. It was all of them at once. Carol was in it. Douglas was in it. My mother, who was alive and asleep in a house 400 miles away, was in it. Then we ran, and the hollow came apart. I lost Benjamin Brooks in the first minute. He went left when the rest of us went right, and he was gone. And we heard him calling. And then we heard him calling from 2 directions at once. and Judith grabbed my collar and said, "Do not answer, do not answer, do not answer." I lost Charles Sanders at the stream. He stopped and turned around and told us to keep going, and he stood in the water with the rifle up. There were 3 shots. There was a long pause. There was a 4th shot, and I have never been able to decide what that 4th shot was for. There were 4 of us on the ridge at first light: me, Natalie, Judith, and Brittany, who had stopped speaking entirely and who would not put the phone down. And then, when the sun cleared the eastern ridge and put light on the hollow, the whole world simply gave us back the trail. It was right there, 50 yards away, obvious, worn, marked, exactly where Douglas had said it would be on the first afternoon, and I understood then with total clarity that the thing had never been lost, and neither had we. We had been kept, and now, for reasons that belonged entirely to it, we were being released. We walked out in 3 hours. There is a specific horror in ordinary things after something like that. There was a family at the trailhead unloading a cooler. There was a young ranger who took one look at us and got on his radio. There was a woman in the parking area who asked if we were all right and offered us a bag of pretzels, and Natalie started laughing and could not stop, and then she was on her knees on the asphalt, and it was not laughing anymore. The search ran 9 days. 230 people, dogs, aircraft, volunteers from 4 counties. They found Charles Sanders in the stream, 2 miles from where he stood, with the rifle still in his hands and every round fired. The report said his injuries were consistent with a fall. They found one of Benjamin Brooks's boots. They never found Carol Watson. They never found Douglas James. I gave my statement 4 times. By the 4th time, I had learned to leave things out. I learned that if you say the word that Judith would never say out loud, a particular expression comes over the face of the person taking the statement, and everything you have told them before that word gets quietly reclassified. So I said we became disoriented. I said we panicked. I said we split up. All of that is true. It is simply not the truth. 2 things. The first is the audio file. It was recording in my chest pocket for most of that second afternoon, because I had bumped the button climbing over a windfall and never noticed. 3 minutes and 9 seconds in, Natalie Ramirez laughs. She was standing 8 feet from me at the time, and she was not laughing, and she had not laughed in 2 days. She heard the playback in a parking lot outside Luray and asked me to turn it off, and we have not spoken in 6 years, and I understand why. The second is the reason I am telling you this at all. Judith Kelly called me in October, 3 months after. She said 1 sentence and then she hung up, and I have not heard from her since, and she does not answer letters. She said, "It does not always stay, because here is what I have not told anyone until now. For 11 years I have lived in a house in a flat part of the country where you can see for 2 miles in every direction, and there is not a mountain within 600 miles. I have a good life. I have people who love me. I sleep with the window closed in July, and I have never once explained to my wife why. And perhaps twice a year, always in the summer, always in the small hours, somebody outside my window says my name. They get it wrong. They get it slightly wrong, the way it was wrong in the hollow, the emphasis a half beat off, as though it were learned from a recording played too slow, but they get a little closer every year, and I do not answer. There is a rule I live by now, and it has cost me 2 friendships and the better part of a marriage. If a voice calls my name from another room, I do not answer it. I do not call back. I stand up, I walk to the doorway, and I look at the face that made the sound before I let a single word out of my mouth. People think it is a joke I have carried on for too long. They think it is a small, strange habit, like knocking on wood, like counting steps. It is not a habit. It is the only reason I am able to sit in a house at night with the windows open, and even that is not entirely true, because I have not opened a window after sundown in 6 years. 8 of us walked into the eastern hollows of Shenandoah on a Tuesday in July. 3 of us walked out on Sunday. The trip was supposed to be nothing. That is the part nobody understands when I try to explain it. We were not chasing anything. We were not filming a series or hunting a legend or looking for a story to sell. We were a hiking club out of Fredericksburg, the sort of group that gets together twice a month for 11 miles and a diner breakfast afterward, and every summer we picked one long weekend and went somewhere far enough from a road that our phones gave up. That was the whole ambition. Sweat, blisters, cold water from a filter, and 4 nights of somebody else doing the cooking. I kept the permits and the maps because I was the one who cared about that sort of thing. I was 39 that summer, and I had walked most of the Blue Ridge in pieces, and I thought I understood what the Appalachians were. Old mountains, worn down and soft in the shoulders. Nothing left up there but bear, deer, hornets, and the ruins of people who had been moved off the land a lifetime ago. The destination was Judith's idea. Judith Kelly was 68 and the strongest walker among us, which was a running joke that stopped being a joke the first time any of us tried to keep her pace on a climb. She had come up in Madison County, and her mother had come up in a hollow that no longer had a name on any current map, and in February she asked the group if we could do something for her while she was still able to do it. She wanted to walk in to the place her mother had been born. She wanted to stand in it. The park had taken that land in the 1930s, the way it took hundreds of homesteads, and the families had been carried down the mountain in wagons and trucks and set down in the flatlands to start over. The buildings came apart. The orchards went wild. The stone chimneys stayed, because stone stays. She called it Sisk Hollow. That was her mother's family name. Nobody said no to Judith. So there were 8 of us in the gravel lot at the bottom end of the ridge on a hot Tuesday morning, sorting gear on the tailgates of 3 vehicles while the cicadas ground away in the trees. Natalie Ramirez was 35, and the closest thing I had to a second in command, a woman who could read a topographic map upside down in the rain, and who never once, in 9 years, lost her temper with any of us. She carried the satellite messenger. Douglas James was 54, a retired lineman who had hunted these mountains since he was a boy and who had opinions about everything, most of them delivered at a volume you could hear from the back of the line. Carol Watson was 50 and came for the birds, not the miles. She wore a recorder on her chest strap, and she had a library of songs on it going back 9 years. Warblers and thrushes, and one recording of a whippoorwill. She was so proud of that she made you listen to it, whether you wanted to or not. Benjamin Brooks was 42, and fixed things. Stoves, poles, zippers, arguments. Charles Sanders was 57, quiet as furniture, the man who built the fire every night and never asked to be thanked for it. And Brittany Price was 32, the youngest, and she filmed everything, and we teased her for it, and later that phone was the only thing anybody in an office ever took seriously. There was an old man in the lot when we shouldered our packs. He was leaning against the front fender of a truck that had not moved in a long time, judging by what was growing under it, and he watched us the way you watch weather coming. Judith said good morning to him. She had that way about her. He asked where we were headed, and Judith told him, and he did not say anything for long enough that Douglas laughed to fill the space. Then the old man said that there was nothing up in there. Judith said that she knew that her people had been moved off it, and the old man said, "No, you are hearing me wrong. There is nothing up in there." He said it slowly, the way you repeat an address to someone who is not writing it down. Then he got in his truck and did not start it, and he was still sitting in it, not starting it, when we crossed the road and went in under the trees. The first 4 miles were beautiful. I want that in the record, because everything after this gets ugly, and I do not want anyone thinking those mountains are ugly. The trail followed a creek up through hemlock and poplar, and the light came down through the canopy in long green columns, and there were pools deep enough to sit in with the water going over the rocks so loud we had to raise our voices. Carol got a hooded warbler on the recorder and made us all stand still for it. Brittany filmed Douglas slipping on a wet stone and going down hard on his backside, and he swore at her for 11 minutes, and it is the funniest footage anybody has ever taken of any of us. We ate lunch on a slab of granite in the sun, then we left the maintained trail. Sisk Hollow was not on the park map, but it was on a 1931 survey sheet that Judith had gotten copied at a county office, and the drainage was still there, because drainages do not move. We followed the creek up its eastern fork through a laurel thicket so tight we walked single file with our arms up, and the ground steepened, and the sound of the water fell away below us, and then the woods opened into a bowl of flat ground under enormous old trees. The hollow was there, the way she said it would be. 2 stone chimneys standing in the open with nothing around them. A low wall of stacked rock running along a slope, holding back a terrace where somebody had once grown corn. A square depression in the dirt full of ferns that had been a root cellar. Apple trees gone feral and knotted, still fruiting. Hard little green things not worth eating. And higher up on the shoulder of the slope, 13 field stones set upright in 2 rows, weathered blank, no names on any of them. Judith walked to the nearer chimney and put her palm flat against it and stood there with her back to us for a while, and none of us said anything, because it was hers. We made camp 50 yards off, on the flat by the creek. I have gone over that decision more times than I can count. There were better sites. The ground was damp and the bowl held the cold, but it was Judith's night, and it was her mother's ground, and it did not occur to any one of us to camp anywhere else. The trouble started at dusk, and it started as an absence. I was the one who noticed. I had come back from filtering water and I stopped on the bank with the bottles in my hands because something was wrong with my ears, and it took me the better part of a minute to work out that what was wrong was that there was nothing in them, no insects. In a Virginia hollow in the second week of July, at that hour, the sound should have been a wall, katydids, crickets, the whole grinding machinery of a summer night. There was the creek, and there was nothing else. I stood there long enough that Natalie came down to see what I was looking at, and she listened, and I watched her face change. Neither of us said it out loud. We went back up to the fire and we ate, and Charles fed the flames, and Judith told a story about her mother stealing a hen, and everybody laughed. Nobody mentioned the silence. 8 adults sat in a lightless bowl in the mountains, and every single one of us had noticed, and every single one of us decided that it was not worth ruining the evening. We went to our tents around 11. At some point after 2 in the morning, something walked the perimeter of our camp. I heard it, and I told myself bear. It was heavy and unhurried, and it stopped often, and every time it stopped I could hear it breathing, and the breathing was too high up. That is the detail my mind kept trying to file away and could not. The sound of the breath was coming from above the height of my own head while I lay on the ground, and it moved past my tent from left to right, and then it came back from right to left, and on the second pass it stopped directly behind me, close enough that the nylon moved. And then it made a sound that I have never been able to describe to anybody in a way that did not make me sound unwell. It was Judith's voice, not words, just the little sound she made in her throat before she started a sentence, the small cough of a woman about to speak. It made that sound 3 times. Then it went up the slope, and the insects came back on all at once, like a switch had been thrown, and I lay there with my eyes open until the gloom went gray. The deer that stood up. In the morning, nobody wanted to be the first one to say anything, so we did what people do. We made coffee. We discussed the water level. Douglas complained about his knee. It was Carol who broke it, and she broke it by accident. She had left the recorder running overnight on a stump at the edge of camp. She did that sometimes, hoping for owls, for whippoorwills, for the sounds that only exist between 2 and 4 in the morning. She sat down on the rock by the fire ring with the little unit in her lap and her headphones on, scrubbing through the file at speed the way she always did, and I watched her face go from bored to puzzled to something else. She took the headphones off. She held them out toward Natalie, who was closest. Natalie listened for perhaps 9 seconds. Then she pulled them off her head so fast she took a piece of her own hair with them. We all listened, one at a time. Nobody said much between turns. What was on the recording was this. For 4 hours there was nothing but the creek. Then, at 1 minute past 2 in the morning, something came close to the microphone, and there was a long stretch of breathing, slow and wet and deliberate. And then a voice said Carol. It was Carol's voice. It said her own name in her own voice, 3 times, with a slightly different weight each time, the way a person practices a word in a language they do not speak. Carol, Carol, Carol. And then it said, come out here. The recording ran another 2 hours after that, with nothing on it at all. Carol sat very still with her hands on her knees while the rest of us worked our way through the reasonable explanations, and there were a lot of them, and Benjamin was the loudest about it. Sound carries strangely in a bowl. Somebody talking in their sleep. An echo off the rock face, a hiker on the ridge, even a bird, because there are birds that mimic, and a mockingbird will run through a car alarm and a rusty gate, and half a dozen other species without breaking rhythm. I wanted to believe him. I want that on the record too. Judith did not join the discussion. She had gone to stand at the edge of camp facing up the slope toward the fieldstones, and she stayed there with her arms folded until we ran out of theories, and then she came back and said one sentence. She said, we should go down today. Douglas laughed at her. That is not fair to Douglas, who was a good man and who died being braver than I was. But he did laugh, and he said that we had walked 11 miles to get here, and he was not turning around because a bird had learned Carol's name, and 4 people agreed with him, and I was one of them. I was the one holding the permits and the plan. I could have called it. 8 people were looking at me, and I said that we would do the day loop up to the ridge and reassess at supper. We reassessed at supper. By then it was far too late. The ridge walk started well enough. We went up out of the hollow on the old road trace, which was still visible as a shelf cut into the slope, and we found the remains of a spring house and a section of iron pipe and, in a tangle of greenbrier, the rusted frame of a bed. Brittany filmed all of it. Judith walked ahead of everybody with her jaw set. We saw the deer at about 11 in the morning. It was standing in a shaft of light in a stand of second growth, maybe 60 yards off the trace, and Carol saw it first and put her hand up, and we all stopped. Because a deer at 60 yards in the open is a good thing to see. It was a doe, thin, gray-brown, ordinary. It was standing on its hind legs, not rearing, not up on the hind legs to reach a branch, which deer will do, which any of us had seen 100 times. It was standing the way a person stands, with the spine vertical and the head level and the front legs hanging down loose at its sides, and it was perfectly still, and it was facing us. We watched it for what Brittany's footage says was 51 seconds. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. It did not move either, except that at one point its head tipped over to one side, all the way over, until the ear touched the shoulder, and it held it there. Then it dropped down onto all 4 legs and walked off into the trees, and it walked wrong. The legs went in the wrong order. I do not have a better way to say it than that. Anybody who has spent time in the woods knows how a deer moves. This moved like something that had watched a deer move and had gotten most of it right. Douglas took his rifle out of his pack. I want to be clear that firearms are not permitted for hunting in that park, and that Douglas knew it, and he had brought a bolt action anyway, broken down in the bottom of his pack, and he had lied to me about it at the trailhead. I found out at that moment, along with everybody else. He assembled it there on the trace with his hands shaking, and he said the word bear twice, to nobody in particular, and nobody argued with him. Carol was crying. She had watched birds for 30 years, and she had a better eye for how an animal is supposed to hold itself than anyone I have known, and she had gotten a very long look through her binoculars. She said that its eyes were on the front. We found the tracks on the way back. They crossed the road trace in soft ground near the spring, and they were deer tracks, clean and deep, 4 of them in the stride of an animal at a walk. And then, without any break in the spacing, without any pause or scuff or gather, the next print in the line was a bare human foot. Then another, heel, arch, ball toes, longer than mine by a lot, and pressed deeper at the tips as though the thing had been leaning forward, and the stride length between them was better than 5 feet. The line of them went up the slope toward our camp. Benjamin got down on his knees in the mud and put his own hand into the print and turned it around and looked up at us with an expression I had never seen on him, because Benjamin was a man who fixed things, and this was the first thing in his life he could not take apart. We got back to the hollow at 4 in the afternoon. The camp had been visited. Nothing was taken. That was the part that made my stomach turn over. A bear tears through a camp. A raccoon opens a pack. Nothing had been opened. Everything had been moved. Every tent had been turned to face inward, toward the fire ring, doors pointing in. The bear canisters had been stacked, one on top of another, in a column 3 high, and they had not been dented or chewed. Charles's boots, which he had left outside his tent to air, were set neatly at the center of the ring of tents, side by side, toes together, and on the trunk of the big poplar at the edge of camp, up at a height of about 9 feet, somebody had cut 8 marks in the bark. 8 parallel gouges, each about a foot long, arranged in a row, all the same depth. 8 of us. Douglas counted them out loud, and then wished that he had not. What came for Charles? We should have walked out that night. I have said this at kitchen tables and in 2 offices and once to a group of people whose job it was to write down what I said, and every time I say it the words come out the same. We should have walked out that night, in the black, 11 miles, with headlamps, and we would have lost maybe 1 person to a broken ankle. Instead, we did the sensible thing, which was to stay put until first light, because the sensible thing on that mountain was designed for a mountain that did not have that on it. Natalie sent a message on the satellite unit at 5:30. There was no emergency to declare that would not have sounded insane, so she sent our position and a note that we intended to exit in the morning. The unit reported the message as delivered. We found out much later that it never reached anyone. There is no explanation for that in any manual. We built the fire big. Charles took that on himself, the way he took everything on himself. And he had a wall of downed hemlock stacked by dusk, and the flames went up 8 feet, and through heat you could not sit close to. It did not help. I have thought about why, for 6 years, light is supposed to be a thing that pushes back. That night, the fire lit our faces and our hands, and about 4 feet of ground, and then it simply stopped. And past that line, the gloom was so complete that it looked solid, like a wall around us, like we were inside a room whose walls were made of nothing. And the fire made noise, and the noise took our hearing away from us, and so we sat inside a small bright box that we could not see or hear out of, and I have never in my life felt so much like something on a plate. It started at 10. The first thing was the smell, which came in on a shift of air and coated the back of the throat. Wet copper, old pennies in a fist, and under it something worse, something like an animal that had gotten shut in a hot car for a week, and when it came, Judith put her sleeve over her face and Benjamin gagged into the fire. Then the circling began, and this time there was no pretending it was a bear, because it went around us at a fast walk, at a distance of maybe 40 feet, for a long time, round and round in the same direction. The footfalls were heavy, and they were on 2 legs. It never once stumbled. It never once broke stride. And when I turned my head to track it, I always found that it was already on the other side of the camp, which is not possible unless there were 2 of them, and I have made my peace with never knowing. At around 11 at night it started talking. It used Judith's voice first, which is why the sound from the night before had felt like a rehearsal. From out past the firelight it said, "Help me." It said, "Please, I have fallen, I cannot get up." And it said it in Judith Kelly's exact voice, with her exact accent, the flattened vowels of Madison County, while Judith Kelly sat 18 inches from me on a log with both her hands over her mouth. Brittany was filming. That is on the footage. You can hear the voice, and you can see Judith in frame at the same time, and that clip is 31 seconds long, and I have watched it perhaps 100 times, and it is the single worst thing I have ever seen. Then it was a child crying. A small child, 4 or 5 years old, out in the black, crying the way children cry when they have been left somewhere. It went on for a quarter of an hour, and it came from 3 different directions. Carol got up at one point, and Natalie pulled her back down by her belt and held her there. Then it used my voice. It called Natalie's name in my voice, from behind the tents, and it got the pitch exactly, and it got the pattern of my speech exactly, and it said, "Natalie, come here a second, I need a hand." And Natalie looked across the fire at me and saw me sitting there, and I watched something in her break that I do not think ever fully mended. It did that for hours, every voice among us. It knew all our names. At some point I noticed a detail that I have never been able to let go of. It never used Judith's name. It used her voice, but it never called for her. It called for every other one of us by name, over and over, and Judith Kelly it left alone. And when I finally worked that out, I turned to look at her, and she was already looking at me. And she knew that I knew, and she shook her head very slightly, meaning not now. At around 2 in the morning it stopped. Everything stopped. The circling, the voices, even the fire seemed to settle, and the insects came up again out of the grass, that same wall of sound, and after 4 hours of what we had been listening to, it felt like a blessing. We sat there in that ordinary noise for perhaps 20 minutes, and I felt my shoulders come down off my ears for the first time since dusk. Then Charles stood up. He had not said a word in 4 hours. He was looking out past the tents toward the slope, and his face was completely calm, and he said, "That is my brother." Charles Sanders had a brother who had died in 1991. Benjamin got up and took hold of his arm, and Charles took Benjamin's hand off his arm with a gentleness that was somehow worse than force. And he said it again, "That is my brother. He is right there." And he stepped over the log and walked out of the light. I went after him. I want credit for that, and I do not deserve it, because I made it 4 steps past the edge of the firelight, and then I stopped. And I stopped because the smell was there, right there, on my face, and because I could hear something breathing at a height that was not a man's height, and every animal thing in my body locked my legs and would not let me take another step. I stood in the black and I said his name, Charles, Charles. And from about 30 feet away, in Charles Sanders' own voice, something said, "Charles." Then it laughed. It laughed with Douglas's laugh, that big cracked laugh we all knew from 100 trailhead mornings, and it went on laughing for 11 or 12 seconds while I backed up toward the fire with my hands out behind me. And then Charles screamed. It came from a long way off, much farther than a man could walk in that time, up near the top of the slope where the fieldstones were, and it was not a scream of pain. I have heard people scream in pain. It was the sound a person makes when the thing they are looking at is not possible, and it stopped in the middle, and the mountain went quiet, and it stayed quiet until dawn. The thing that wore him back. At first light we went up. I did not want to go. Natalie made us go, and she was right. Because you do not leave a man on a mountain because you are frightened, and because none of us could have lived with the alternative. We went in a tight group with Douglas and his rifle in front and Benjamin behind with a hatchet in his hand, and we followed the slope up past the terrace wall and the wild apples to the 2 rows of field stones, and the ground told us as much as we were ever going to know. Charles's boot prints came up the slope in a straight line. No stumbling, no zigzag. A man walking to something. They stopped in the middle of the stones. There was nothing after them. Not a mark, not a scuff, not a drag. The ground on all sides was soft with leaf litter, and there was not a single print in it in any direction, and the 2 prints where he had stopped were pressed deeper at the toe than at the heel, as though at the last moment he had risen up. His pack was hanging in a tree. It was 11 feet off the ground, hooked on the stub of a broken limb by one shoulder strap, and every buckle on it was fastened. Benjamin got it down with a length of deadfall. Everything was inside. Water, food, a rain shell, his wallet, a photograph of a woman in a plastic sleeve. Carol sat down on the ground and did not get up for a while. We were 400 yards back down the trace, moving fast toward camp to break it down and get out, when Brittany stopped and said, "Oh, thank God." Charles was standing on the trace about 80 feet ahead of us. I felt my knees go. That is the honest reaction. Relief came up through me so hard it made me sick, and Douglas said his name out loud, and Brittany actually took 2 steps toward him before Natalie got a fistful of the back of her shirt. Because Natalie did not move at all. She stood there with her arm out across Brittany's chest like a bar, and she said, very quietly, "Do not." He was too far to see well. He was in his gray shirt. He had his head down and turned slightly, the way Charles held his head. He was standing in the shade under a poplar, and he did not come toward us, and he did not say anything. Douglas called out and asked if he was all right, and Charles said, "I am all right." It was his voice. It was completely his voice, and it was wrong, and here is the only way I can explain how, because I have tried for years. When Charles Sanders spoke, he spoke like a man who did not want to take up anybody's time. Short, flat. This said the words with all the right sounds in the right order and none of the weight in the right places, like a sentence read off a page by someone who had never heard it said. Natalie said, "Charles, what did you say to me at the trailhead on Tuesday?" There was a pause that went on far too long, and then it said, "I am all right." Judith started walking backward. She had her hand behind her, feeling for us. Natalie said, louder, "Charles, what did you say to me at the trailhead?" And it said, "Natalie, come here a second, I need a hand." In my voice, Douglas fired. I do not know if he hit it. The sound of that rifle going off in a hollow at 9 in the morning was so enormous that it blanked out everything for a second. And when I could see again, the trace ahead of us was empty, and there was no body, and there was nothing on the ground. Then, from up on the slope above us, well up the slope, higher and farther than anything could have gotten in that space of time, it screamed. It was Charles's scream, the same one, the identical one, from the night before, right down to where it broke off in the middle. It played it back at us like a recording, twice, and then a third time, and something enormous moved through the canopy above and to our left, and we ran. I am not going to make that sound like anything but what it was. 6 adults ran down a mountain in a panic with packs on. That is how people get hurt, and that is how we got hurt. Benjamin went off the trace. He was behind me, and then he was not, and when I looked, he had taken the fall line straight down through the laurel toward the creek, which was the wrong way and which was also, I understand now, exactly what somebody does when the thing chasing them is above and to the left. He got maybe 40 yards into that thicket. I heard him snapping through it. I heard him stop. Then I heard him laugh. Benjamin Brooks laughed, down in the laurel, a happy, easy laugh, and he said something conversational that I could not make out, and then there was nothing. We did not go in after him. I want to be honest about that. We stood on the trace in a group, and we listened to that silence for a count of maybe 20, and then we kept running. Carol went at the bottom of the road trace, where it dropped toward the creek crossing. She was the last of us, and I looked back, and she had stopped in the middle of the trail with her binoculars up, looking back the way we had come, and she was smiling. I screamed at her. Natalie screamed at her. She lowered the binoculars, and she looked at us, and she said, in a perfectly normal voice, "It is only Charles." Then she turned and walked back up the trace at an easy pace, and she went around the bend, and Carol Watson was never seen again by anyone. 4 of us made the creek: Judith, Natalie, Douglas, Brittany, and me. That is 5. I have written it as 4 for 6 years, in my head, every time, and I have never once been able to work out which one of us my mind keeps trying to leave up there. The fire road. The creek crossing was where Judith told us. We had stopped because Douglas could not breathe. He was 54, and he had run a mile downhill with 20 pounds on his back, and his face had gone a color I did not like, and we put him down on a rock with his head between his knees, and Natalie got the satellite unit out and started sending, and Brittany sat in the water fully clothed and shook, and Judith Kelly stood in the creek with her boots on and said, "It is mine." I asked her what she meant. She said that her mother had talked about it exactly twice. Once when Judith was 9, and had asked why her grandmother would not go back up the mountain even for a funeral, and once at the end, in a room with a machine in it, when she was not entirely sure who Judith was. She said that when the families were up in those hollows there had been an arrangement. She used that word, arrangement. She said there had been something living up on the ridge above Sisk Hollow before her people ever came there, something that the older families knew about and did not name out loud, and that a bargain had been struck by somebody in her line, and that the terms of it were kept every year, and that what was given was not small. She said that when the government came and cleared the hollow in the 1930s, everybody went down the mountain in trucks, and nobody thought to tell the thing on the ridge that the arrangement was over. She said, "It has been up here on its own for 90 years, and it has been very hungry, and it knows my family's blood the way a dog knows a coat." Douglas said, "Then why has it not taken you?" And Judith said, "Because I am the last one, and after me there is nobody to come back." I have gone back and forth for 6 years on whether that is a true story or the story of a frightened woman standing in cold water at the worst hour of her life. It does not matter. What matters is what she did next, which was to take her pack off and set it on the rock and start walking back up the trace. Natalie got in front of her. There was a shoving match in a creek between a woman of 35 and a woman of 68, and Natalie won it, barely. And Judith sat down in the water and cried like I have never heard anybody cry. We got her up. We put her in the middle of the line and we went down. The rest of it was 11 miles of the longest day of my life. It came with us. I want to be very clear that I never saw it, not once, not properly, in all that time. What I had was this. Something moving on the slope above us, parallel, at our pace, all afternoon, sticks breaking at a height that made no sense, and the voices, all day, from the trees on our left, calling every one of our names and every one of our voices, including the voices of the people we had left behind. And Carol's voice was the one it used most, and it was very good at it. At about 5 in the afternoon, it started using Charles's voice to say something over and over from a distance of maybe 100 yards. It said, "Wait for me. I am all right. Wait for me." Brittany put her hands over her ears and walked the last 4 miles like that, and Natalie walked behind her with a hand on her shoulder blade steering her around the roots. We lost the trace in a laurel hell above the main trail and had to go through it on our hands and knees for 400 yards, which is a thing I would not wish on anybody, because you cannot see more than 2 feet in any direction in that stuff, and the branches close behind you. Somewhere in the middle of it, the sound above us stopped, and I want to tell you that felt like relief, and it did not. It felt like being set down. We came out onto the maintained trail at 7:30 with the light going amber, and then it was ordinary. That is the part nobody ever believes. 4 miles of gentle maintained trail with the sun coming through the hemlocks, and birds, and insects, and at one point a family of 4 coming the other way with a dog, who said good evening to us and looked at us strangely and kept walking. We reached the gravel lot at 9:40 at night, and Douglas got down on the ground next to his own truck and put his forehead on the tire. The truck with the weeds under it was gone. I do not know what that means either. Here is what the record says, because I have read it. The search ran 19 days. It involved 4 agencies, over 200 people, dog teams, and 2 helicopters with thermal equipment. They found Charles Sanders's pack where we told them it would be, in the tree, because we had left it hanging exactly where we found it. They found one of Carol Watson's boots on a rock in the middle of the creek, 3 miles from where she turned around, with the laces still tied. They found nothing else. No bodies, no blood, no clothing, no sign of Benjamin Brooks in the laurel below the trace, and they cut that thicket apart by hand. The official finding was that 4 experienced hikers became separated from their group in difficult terrain. 4 people, because Judith Kelly died 14 months later in her own bed, of a heart that gave out at 69, and the official record, and I disagree about whether that counts. Brittany's footage exists. 51 seconds of a doe standing on its hind legs at 60 yards, which 2 different people have told me is a hoax, and which one very serious person told me he would prefer not to discuss further. 31 seconds of Judith Kelly sitting in front of a fire with her hands over her mouth, while her own voice calls for help from the black behind her. Brittany does not have those files anymore. She gave them to me and moved to Oregon, and we exchanged messages at Christmas. Douglas James never went into the woods again. He told me once, at a diner, that the thing he could not get past was not the deer or the voices or the marks on the poplar. It was that when it laughed at me out beyond the firelight, it used his laugh, and it had only heard his laugh for 2 days, and it had it perfect. Natalie and I still walk, day hikes, popular trails. We do not go anywhere. We cannot see a parking lot from the ridge, and neither of us has ever suggested otherwise, and in 6 years, neither of us has said the word Shenandoah out loud in the other one's company. I moved out of the county. I live in a place with a lawn and a fence and a light on a pole that comes on at dusk and stays on until morning, and there is a line of trees behind the property, maybe 60 feet back, and most of the year I do not think about them. 3 weeks ago I was standing at the kitchen sink with the window open, which I do not do, which I have not done, and which I had done that night, because it was 91 degrees and the air conditioning had failed. Something in that tree line said my name. It said it once, and it waited, and then it said it again, and it was patient about it, the way you are patient with somebody who is only in the next room and has probably not heard you yet. It was my voice. I did not answer. I closed the window and I locked it, and I went and sat in the middle of the house with every light in it burning, and at some point after 3 in the morning I heard it try one more time, farther off, out past the fence. That is my rule, and that is why I have it. If you hear your name called from somewhere you cannot see, do not answer. Do not call back. Do not go to the door. Go and look at the face that made the sound. And if there is no face, then whatever you do, do not let it hear your voice, because it only needs to hear it once.